Hello and welcome back to Skepticus. On this episode of Cynical Sermons, we're going to peel back the scalp and take a good, hard look at the wiring of the human brain. Specifically, I'm talking about the faulty wiring that makes something like religious faith not only possible, but for many, seemingly inevitable. I'm talking, of course, about cognitive biases. Now, that may sound a little dry, a little academic. Cognitive biases, it sounds like something you'd skim over in a Psych 101 textbook. But stick with me here, because this isn't just an academic exercise. Understanding these biases is like being given the administrator password to the human mind. It's the key to understanding why people, smart people, good people, can believe things that are demonstrably, wildly, and sometimes dangerously untrue. Cognitive biases are the little shortcuts that our brains take, the systematic errors in our thinking that happen automatically, often without us even noticing, completely subconsciously. They are the brain's equivalent of autocorrect. And just like autocorrect, they can sometimes change a perfectly good thought into something utterly ridiculous and embarrassing. And here's the hook. The thing that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this. If religion were a piece of software, cognitive biases would be its operating system. They are the foundational code that allows the whole program to run in the first place. We're going to go through a whole list of these glitches in our mental matrix. And with each one, I think you'll see the architecture of faith become clearer and clearer. This isn't about what people believe. It's about why their brains are so eager to believe it in the first place. So buckle up, because we're about to void the warranty on the human brain. Now, before we really dive in, a quick disclaimer is required. Cognitive biases are a universal human feature. They aren't unique to religion. Atheists have them. Scientists have them. Your cat probably has them. We all fall victim to these mental tripwires in every area of our lives, from politics to our personal relationships to deciding which brand of toothpaste to buy. I want to be crystal clear about that. Nobody is immune to cognitive biases. However, while these biases certainly are universal, religion seems to be one place where they are not seen as bugs, but as features. It's like a rich, fertile, perfectly manured soil where these biases can grow and flourish and metastasize into a thick jungle of abject loss of reason. Religion doesn't just tolerate cognitive bias, it cultivates it. It celebrates it. It builds entire cathedrals on top of it. Cognitive bias and religion go together like cocaine and waffles. It might seem like a weird combination at first, but once you see it, you just can't unsee it. And you realize one makes the other go down a whole lot easier. So even though we're all susceptible, today we're focusing on how religion provides the perfect habitat for these biases to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. So let's start with the big one, the one you've all heard of, the undisputed heavyweight champion of mental errors. Confirmation bias is our natural tendency to cherry pick information that confirms what we already believe, while conveniently ignoring anything that might challenge those beliefs. It's the little voice in your head that whispers, "See, I knew it." every time you find a crumb of evidence that supports your worldview. You could honestly just call this the religion bias, because it's the engine that drives 99% of faith-based reasoning. They see the face of Jesus in a piece of toast. That's confirmation. A prayer for a good parking spot gets answered. That's confirmation. It's profoundly, fundamentally, and intellectually dishonest. And it's the living, breathing essence of Christian apologetics. I see this in particular when it comes to anything related to creationism. Creationists don't reject all science. If they did, they wouldn't be on the internet. They wouldn't get in a car or ride in a plane. They wouldn't get surgery from a brain surgeon or from any other medical specialist. They love science. They embrace science, except for when it doesn't confirm their own biases. And then when they need something to confirm their biases, they will only pick and choose the choicest little bits of quasi-scientific knowledge to say, aha, see, that confirms my bias, and everything else in regards to creationism doesn't count, or it's all a massive conspiracy. The backfire effect is what happens when you challenge someone's core beliefs with facts, and instead of changing their mind, they just grip their original belief even tighter. You think that you're shining a light, but all you're doing is making them squint harder and double down. It's why I often like to say that arguing with a biblical literalist, or to put things in another frame of reference, a Christian apologist about Noah's Ark or contradictions in the Gospels, is like playing chess with a pigeon. You can make all the right moves and you can give them the most devastating of empirical, confirmable scientific facts. But the pigeon is just going to knock over the pieces, shit on the board, and strut around like it won. That, my friends, is the backfire effect writ large. Next up is declinism, the belief that the past was so much better than the present, and the future is headed straight for the crapper. This is the lifeblood of conservative religious rhetoric that bemoans the loss of a Christian nation. They paint this Norman Rockwell picture of a past where families were perfect and communities were wholesome, and conveniently forgetting the rampant racism, the systemic sexism, and closets full of gay people living in fear. Declinism demands that you ignore reality in favor of a comforting and completely fictitious past fantasy. Now, obviously, religion in general tends to spawn a certain type of conservatism, but maybe you go to a more liberal denomination, and that's great. But the more conservative your views or your denomination's views, the more likely that you are to indulge wantonly in this pining away for the good old days, a time when nobody got divorced and nobody talked back to their parents and nobody ever came out of the closet where they should always be, where everything was always right with God. That is the heart of Christian conservatism. The just world hypothesis is our deep-seated need to believe, to deeply want to believe that the world somehow is fair. Since the real world is messy and profoundly unfair, religion invented heaven and hell to patch up this glaring flaw, this bug in reality. It assures believers that a magic sky daddy with a giant spreadsheet is keeping track of everything. But the dark underbelly of this is victim blaming. If you believe that the world is just, then when something bad happens to someone, your brain's shortcut is to assume that somehow they must have deserved it. It allows believers to feel safe while still absolving them of any real compassion. I also find that this cognitive bias just really screams to an overall lack of maturity. And that may sound unfair, it may sound accusatory, it may sound elitist. But one of the most important lessons you can learn about life is that often it isn't fair. And while I don't want you to just embrace the unfairness, I mean, fix it when you can, correct it when the means are available to you. But the more time that you spend worrying about whether or not this guy who treated you like an asshole is going to hell and whether Aunt May is really in heaven, the more time you are robbing yourself of living in the moment. It is a great robber of psychic energy because it constantly forces you to think about some cosmic justice that there is just no evidence for. And it keeps you from moving on with your life in the most positive way possible. The last thing I want to say about this just world hypothesis, and it may sound a little snarky, but it's amazing to me how quickly we discard ideas of Santa Claus when we're only 4 or 5 or 6 years old. And yet, how much we cling to this idea of this cosmic scorecard, this heaven and hell. Santa Claus knows if you've been naughty or nice, and that's what determines whether or not you get your toys. And now, to any reasonable adult, that sounds ridiculous. But when I say that the magic sky daddy is going to send those assholes to hell and he's going to send you to heaven, nobody can draw the same connection between those two concepts as though they're completely unrelated. The sunk cost fallacy is our irrational tendency to stick with something, even if it's failing, simply because we've already invested time, money, or emotion into it. Think about someone deconstructing their faith. They've spent their entire life in the church. Their investment isn't just time and money. It's their entire identity, their family, their social circle. To walk away would be to admit that this entire life was maybe based on a falsehood. And the psychological pain that arises from that can be so immense that it feels easier to just keep going, faking it, because acknowledging the loss would simply hurt too much. We often hear about sunk cost fallacy with regard to like financial decisions, right? You've spent $100 on a stock that's now worth $5 and you can't sell it because then that would realize the loss. So you just hold on to it forever, even though it eventually goes to 50 cents or to zero or what have you. But I find that the sunk cost fallacy is so endemic in those who were raised in the church, believed probably devoutly at some point in their life. And over time, it just starts to feel more and more silly. But they can't bring themselves to actually articulate that truth. They can't bring themselves to admit to themselves or to anyone else around them that it sounds silly. Because to do that feels like they are invalidating their lifetime investment in this religion, even if they don't believe in it at all. The Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the bias where the less a person knows about a subject, the more confident that they are in their expertise. True experts are often humble, but novices have scaled the peak of Mount Stupid and are shouting their ignorance from the summit. This is the guy who's never read the entire Bible, or maybe not even most of it, but he has memorized 20 gotcha verses. He can't read a word of Greek, but he will confidently tell you what a word really means because he's looked it up in a Strong's Concordance. His ignorance is so profound that he is incapable of recognizing his own incompetence, making him dangerously and insufferably confident. I see this all the time on the internet. Maybe it's because of the channel that I have and the particular focus that I've chosen. But of course, I get tied into a lot of this rah-rah, amateur Christian apologetic content coming from YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and anywhere else. And you get these people confidently proclaiming that the Bible doesn't say this, or that it does say this, that the Bible absolutely condemns all aspects of homosexuality, or that the Bible absolutely does not endorse slavery, or that the Bible has no interest in genocide, or on and on and on. And they will tell you all these things, and then they will actually put out these reaction videos to incredibly credentialed people like Dan McClellan or Kip Davis or Dr. Josh, and they will talk as though these people are involved in conspiracies, that they don't know what they're talking about, even though the content creators themselves have never even stepped foot in a biblical scholarship course. The Barnum effect is our tendency to see personal specifics in vague, general statements. It's the engine that powers horoscopes, and it is the absolute backbone of every sermon that's ever been preached. A preacher will often start by saying something like, "Someone here is carrying a heavy burden," and nearly everyone in the room thinks, "I'm carrying a heavy burden. He's talking to me." It allows us to take the mundane chaos of everyday life and reinterpret it as a personal conversation with the creator of the universe himself, making us feel special and seen, and most importantly, confirmed. It is amazing to me sometimes how people do not see the parallels in church sermons and cold readings. If you don't know what a cold reading is, it's when these charlatans, these so-called psychics will get into a room, right? And they'll say, "Oh, somebody had a relative, I'm getting an R, with their name started with R. He was an older gentleman. Yeah, somebody had a grandpa named Robert or Rick or something who died." And of course, then you start to get someone going, "Yes, yes, my grandpa Robert just died a year ago." And it's just these general ridiculous platitudes that could apply and probably do apply to damn near anyone. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong in taking meaning from general statements if it helps you, but also always keep in mind that the basis of these statements are general platitudes. So there should never be something hyper specific to your life taken from it, because they are just generic words. Like when people read Psalms, this is part of why I hate the book of Psalms. I know it may sound horrible for me to say because people love the book of Psalms, but Psalms are poems, they're lyrics, they're prayers, they're lamentations. They are these general, touchy-feely, poetic verses that could apply and do apply to damn near anything. And yet people will pull these verses out of Psalms completely out of context, and they will throw them in your face as some way to prove their theological point, because they know that with these generalities that come from these poetic verses, they can leverage the Barnum effect all day long. How would you like to be one of my advisors? I'm using Skepticus's memberships as a way to allow you to have a voice in the content and the direction of this channel. I hope to see you in the membership pool, and I want to hear your voice in what Skepticus is doing going forward. The framing effect shows that we are unduly influenced by context, by delivery, and also how information is just presented to us. We all think that we're immune to advertising, and yet the industry is worth billions of dollars. Why do you think that is? It's because framing works. Have you ever paid attention to the machinations of an effective preacher? The soaring music, the carefully modulated voice, the subtle cues. It's all framing. And this is especially potent in the prosperity gospel. The pastor in the Armani suit and the Rolex, he's not just a symbol of greed or corruption. It's a carefully constructed framing. It presents wealth not as material excess, but as a sign of God's favor. It frames his message with an aura of divine endorsement. If he's godly and rich, then you too can be godly and rich. If you just sow a seed into his ministry, if you just hit that collection plate, if you just tithe properly, you too can receive these riches. The language itself is a frame. You're not just giving him money, you're investing in the kingdom. It's all designed to make you interpret the situation in a way that benefits them. And I want to point out, because this applies to the framing effect, this applies to many of these biases. Of course, they can be manipulated against you. And of course, we can point these fingers at preachers, at those giving sermons, at those holding services. Now, does that mean that I think that all of religion is corrupt? Do I think it's wrong that the preacher presents something in a certain way? Do I think it's wrong that the music is uplifting? Do I think it's wrong that he uses audible cues to hold your attention? Of course not. That's called good public speaking. But it's also important to understand when these things are playing on our mind, because it creates this rich, fertile soup of deception that, if we're not aware of it, can lead us down a path of believing in things that we would otherwise consider to be ridiculous. Now, this one is so simple, it almost feels like cheating. In-group bias is our tendency to justify and unfairly favor those who belong to our own group. What else is there to say? That's religion. Religion is institutionalized in-group bias on a planetary scale. It's not just a social phenomenon. It's written into the doctrine. The flock versus the world. The saved versus the damned. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. The entire framework is built on creating a sharp, clear distinction between us and them, which makes it easy to love your brothers and sisters while also dehumanizing everyone else. A couple notes on this real quick. First of all, I will point out that this is one of the problems that I have with Christianity in general, with Abrahamic faiths, and really with any monotheistic tradition, because monotheistic traditions tend to be more us versus them. Now, I'm not saying polytheistic traditions don't have this problem too, but like if you look at the old Roman Empire, part of the way that they thrived was not by telling everyone that we've conquered you, now you must throw out your gods and accept ours. No, they said, we've conquered you, now you'll worship our gods and we will also accept yours. It all became part of this Roman pantheon, this conglomeration of gods and deities. Some of them were duplicates and triplicates of what they already had. That didn't matter because it was just seen as one big melting pot of religion. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't a lot of bias that went on amongst natives and foreigners and your religion versus mine, but it was much less problematic when it was just seen as a bunch of pantheons and we're going to put all the pantheons together. I also find this us versus them mentality to be a key underpinning of the pervasive LGBT hatred that we see throughout Christianity. And here's why I say this. I know that there are LGBT affirming Christian denominations and Christian congregations, but in general, there is still this huge underlying current of queer hatred in the Christian faith. And no, it's not just because of a handful of verses in the Bible, because if it's about a handful of verses in the Bible, I can find a whole bunch of reasons to hate all types of people. But they focus on queer hatred because when you're sitting in a typical congregation, let's say it's an American Protestant congregation in the South, just by pure statistics, you can assume that 90 to 95% of the people in that congregation were probably born straight, because most people are. So it's really easy when the pastor pulls up his verses saying about how man being with man is evil and how this is an abomination and how we have to shun them and how they can only be Christian if they deny everything about their personality and their sexuality. And it's easy to say that when you have none of those urges. And it's easy to say that when you can shun someone and there is no cost to you whatsoever. Because you've got your straight relationship, your straight endeavors are completely supported by the church. You don't have to care about that. So it's easy to shun someone who has a desire that you've never had and may never have. Now, I understand there are some deeply closeted individuals in some of these congregations, but statistically speaking, most of the people in that congregation were born with no desire to be with someone of the same sex. And that's fine. The problem comes when they decide to pull their us versus them crap and spread hatred over everyone who doesn't have the same sexuality. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where your judgments are influenced by what springs most easily to mind. Things that are recent or emotionally powerful or frequently repeated seem more important than they actually are. So, is it any wonder that when some horrible tragedy strikes, the default Christian response is the horrifically tone-deaf bromide of thoughts and prayers? Now, I'm not entirely letting them off the hook, but for some, I think it's an automatic reflex. They've been trained week after week that prayer is the answer to everything. It's so easy. It's so easy to reach for. Hell, I can pray for someone right now. It's the most available tool in their mental toolbox, and it requires no effort. A crisis occurs, their brain searches for a solution, and the first program that pops up is prayer.exe. It's a worthless, performative gesture, but it's also the most easily accessible response that their conditioning can possibly provide. This is also why the Bible just becomes the default answer for everything. Because to go beyond the Bible requires you to actually engage with the problem. It requires you to understand or look for resources that you may not already have or that you may not have researched in the past. But you know what's sitting in every pew of every church that I've ever been in? A whole bunch of Bibles. And when you have this ridiculously simple, over-deployed resource that is treated as the answer for everything, of course they try to cram it down your throat for every stupid possible problem they can think of. Now, this one feels a lot like confirmation bias, but with a subtle twist. Belief bias is our tendency to judge the strength of an argument based on how believable we find its conclusion, rather than on its actual logical validity. Confirmation bias is about seeking out evidence that confirms our worldview. Belief bias is about evaluating it. For example, an apologist might present a terribly flawed argument like moral truth is divinely inspired, and the Bible contains moral truth. Therefore, the Bible must be divinely inspired. This is a logical train wreck. The first premise is a massive, unproven assertion, but because a believer already agrees with the conclusion, their belief bias kicks in and they perceive it as a sound, powerful argument. It short circuits their critical thinking faculties because the destination feels right. So they don't bother to check the map. I literally watched this 3-hour discussion a few days ago. It had Alex O'Connor and it had a Christian apologist on it. And there was a third panelist. And the Christian apologist asserted over and over again with a straight face that because some Christians, and I'm sure he believes many Christians or most Christians, feel better when they convert from being an atheist to a Christian or from being a Hindu to a Christian, that is evidence for the correctness of Christianity. The two are completely unrelated. I have no doubt that if you're an atheist today and you decide to convert to Christianity, you'll probably feel good about it, at least for a while. If you weren't going to feel good about it, you wouldn't have converted in the first place. If you were a Hindu or a Muslim and now you've decided to become a Christian, of course you're doing that because you think it's going to help you in some regard. And I'm sure that at least for a while, it will. But the idea that you feel better about it after doing it is no evidence that the Christian God is real, that Jesus was resurrected. It's no evidence of anything in Christianity. And yet this belief bias leads Christians to look at this incredible pile of anecdotal crap about other Christians saying that they feel good and then using that as their evidence for Christianity. Groupthink is what happens when the desire for harmony and conformity within a group leads to disastrous decision-making. Dissent is discouraged because it's uncomfortable and it threatens the social standing. Not only does this apply perfectly to religion, but religion essentially weaponizes it. They will happily ostracize you for going against the group. They will shame you for having the audacity to question doctrine, because to do so is to expose yourself as having a lack of faith or a rebellious spirit. I mean, there are 1,000 different examples of this with religion and Christianity. I mean, a couple that really come to mind. For example, let's look at the Trinity. Anyone who tells you that the Trinity made sense to them when they first heard about it is lying to you. Now, they may not be consciously lying anymore because at this point they may have convinced themselves that it's true and therefore they've stopped even remembering a time when it didn't make sense. But there is nobody in the history of man who has ever sat down, read the Bible the first time from page 1 to page last and said, I see the Trinity there. No one. Even when you explain the concept to someone for the first time, it makes no sense. There are 3 gods, but they're not 3 gods. They're one God, but they're separate. They're completely separate, but they're one. Oh, okay. Yeah. And yet, if you question it too much, you're going to get some nasty looks. Now, my experience in Christianity was this. Most of the people that I knew that were in the church or, had deep theological thoughts, they didn't mind you asking questions. Most of them were pretty fine with you questioning doctrine and dogma. But when you would ask the questions, they had their standard apologetic response, and then they expected you to accept the apologetic response and shut the hell up. If you kept asking questions after that, that's when they got annoyed. The whole doctrine of faith is built on this idea. It's the idea that you don't ask questions, you just believe. where you can ask some questions, but once you've gotten the standard apologetic answer, then just accept it and move on. Reactance is that defiant, toddler-like impulse to do the opposite of what someone is trying to make you do. It kicks in when we feel that our freedom is being threatened. One of the best modern examples of this is the manufactured bullshit war on Christmas. For decades, Christianity was the unchallenged cultural wallpaper of America. Now, with society, at least in some areas, becoming somewhat more pluralistic, you see happy holiday signs. A Starbucks cup is just plain red instead of specifically saying Merry Christmas. For some Christians, this isn't seen as inclusion. It's seen as an attack. It's a constraint on their freedom because they expect that their religion and the references to their religion will be the only references that they ever have to see in the town square. Their reactance is to declare war, to get performatively angry about a coffee cup. Now, the same also goes for the mere existence of queer people in a Disney movie. How dare they ever reference a queer person in a Disney movie? They see it as a personal affront. It's an attack on their values that they must push back against. It's not a rational response. It is a visceral, emotional reaction to a perceived loss of cultural dominance, and it's toxic as hell. So what have we learned? We've gone through a whole laundry list of mental misfires, and there are many more of them, many more that I could apply to religion, but these are the ones that really feel like they are the core of religion. They're not just something that religious people are susceptible to. They are the basis of the religion itself. The confirmation bias, the backfire effect, declinism, the just world hypothesis, sunk cost fallacies, Dunning-Kruger, Barnum framing, in-group bias, availability bias, belief bias, groupthink, reactance. That's just a sample platter. There are dozens more. It should be painfully clear by now why I say that these biases are the operating system of faith. Religion didn't necessarily invent these biases, I'll give them that, but it has perfected their application. It has created a system where these mental errors are not corrected, but they're encouraged, where doubt isn't a virtue, but a sin, where critical thinking isn't a tool, but a temptation. They've built a structure with 4 foundational pillars. On one corner, you have the Father, on another, the Son, on another, the Holy Spirit, and then holding up that crucial 4th corner of the entire edifice is cognitive bias. Without it, the whole roof just comes crashing down. It's a system that has looked at every glitch, every exploit, every piece of faulty code in the human psyche and said, how can we roll all of this up into one unified system of control? I know the answer is religion. And I want to hammer away on this as much as possible because in other areas of life, take investing, for example, a good investor will be actively trying to be vigilant about cognitive biases. They will actively try to wash them out of their mental cycles. And we're all susceptible to them to some extent. We all sometimes fall prey to cognitive biases. But if you are trying to think better, if you're trying to come up with better answers and move yourself and the people around you forward, you actively look to defeat cognitive biases. And yet, the cognitive biases that I have brought up today are heralded as features of the religion. If there are any of these cognitive biases that God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit or Vishnu or Thor or anyone else would like to chime in on and tell me how I have screwed this up, how this really has nothing to do with religion, I am all ears. Yeah, there you go. I guess they agree with me. This video has been approved by Yahweh and by Cognitive Biases International. Thank you for being with me. I hope to see you on future videos. Until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.